Okay, you're good to go.
Okay, good morning or good afternoon. Buenas tardes. As a Mexican, I don't know if to say buenas tardes or buenos dias. As a Mexican American, as a Mexican, I should know, but I think it's tardes, no, Dr. Jimenez? Okay. Yeah. Buenas tardes, todos. I'm very happy to be here today to provide or introduce a brilliant educator, leader in our community. Someone whom I've known for several years now. So I'll go ahead and introduce him. My name is Dr. Álvaro Huerta. I'm an associate professor at Cal Poly Pomona in Ethnic and Women's Studies and Urban and Regional Planning. And we are very excited to have a guest speaker today with us, not just the YouTube, but also on Facebook Live. Dr. Oscar Jimenez-Castellanos is the chair and professor of education at Trinity College University. He's the executive director of the Center for Educational Leadership there. He has previous affiliations with prestigious universities, other prestigious universities, such as Santa Clara University, UC Berkeley, Stanford University, and Arizona State University. Currently, he's a visiting professor at USC in the Department of Education. He's received numerous awards and fellowships, like the prestigious Ford Fellowship. I say prestigious because I also have the Ford Fellowship, and that's how we know each other. Our roots are similar. We both come, our families come from Mexico, for first generation university students, something that he'll get into. The area of education is a very important one. Too often it's not spoken about. Too often at the national level, we hear issues about immigration, but we don't hear enough about education in the case of Latinos and Latinas when it comes to issues of racism, when it comes to issues of xenophobia. So today, Dr. Jimenez-Castellanos will provide us with an overview of his research, recent research in this very important topic. So take it away, my friend.
All right, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, let me just say one more thing. As he's speaking, people feel free to include comments or questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And after he speaks, I'll go ahead and read him some of these questions. So feel free and post them as you think about these questions, and towards the end of the presentation or after the presentation, that's when we'll address them. Take it away, amigo.
Muy bien, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Álvaro Huerta and the Cal Poly Pomona community for inviting me to give this talk today. I'm really honored. I would also like to thank all of you for making time, even those of you who are captive audiences. You showed up, so thank you. This talk is titled Examining the History of School Funding Disparities Towards an Anti-Racist, Anti-Xenophobic School Funding System. This project builds upon my previous works published in Teachers College Record and Aslan Journal that applied critical race theory and racist nativism to school finance, respectively. Given the early stage of this project and the limited time today, I would like to apologize ahead of time for a couple of things. One, if I omit or gloss over something that you find incredibly important, hopefully we can follow up after today and have deeper conversations, and obviously during the Q&A as well. And secondly, I apologize if you're expecting a legal or political argument or feasibility. That may come at a later time, but if you have any recommendations regarding that, it would be much appreciated, even though I will provide some policy recommendations, initial policy recommendations today. But the purpose of the talk today is to make a broad scholarly argument about the needs to transform our school finance system. So your feedback is greatly appreciated. And if you would like to collaborate on any aspect of this project, feel free to contact me at any time. I would like to share a little bit about myself to begin. I was born in Jalisco, Mexico. Like many migrants, my parents were small business owners in Mexico. Vendían pasturería for agriculture, and yet worked as farm workers in California to give their children a chance at a better life. We moved to a small agricultural town in California where I grew up in Dixon. All 7 of my siblings and I graduated from high school and attended four-year universities. As you can see, the CSU Sacramento being one of them, and also San Diego State University being another. Including 7 master's degrees and 2 PhDs. We are all first-generation college students. After earning my BA and my teaching credential, I became a dual language teacher and worked for 7 years in K-12 public urban schools. In graduate school, I was fortunate enough to be trained and mentored by Dr. Ruben Espinosa, who helped, he was the first Chicano school finance expert in California and the first Chicano to graduate from sociology department at Stanford University, who helped develop the California Economic Impact Aid funding formula in the late 1970s and conducted the research behind the Rodriguez v. LAUSD case in 1992. I have worked in the area of ELL school finance policy, among other areas of research, for the past 12 years at Arizona State University, Santa Clara, Trinity University. In 2016-17, I was a visiting professor or visiting scholar at Berkeley. Álvaro has no allegiance to Berkeley, as you all probably know by now. My host there was Bruce Fuller, with an affiliation at Stanford's Policy Analysis for California Education. And I am a visiting professor now at USC Rossier School of Education with my host, Dean Noguera, who just took over this year. As a scholar, I have been able to distinguish myself in the broader academic community and have been fortunate to receive several national prestigious and highly competitive awards due to my contributions in the field of education. And I have served as a school finance expert for various states across the country as well. We are living through a racial reckoning and juxtaposition, as you all know, with 2 diametrically opposing forces. The first force has been brought forth by the Black Lives Matters movement recently, started in 2013 after the murder of the teenager Trayvon Martin. But it was really this summer that the Black Lives Matter gained really worldwide recognition after the death of George Floyd in the hands of a white police officer after sitting in his neck for over 8 minutes while other police officers witnessed this and while being recorded. And George Floyd saying those tragic words, "I can't breathe." Recently, the Breonna Taylor case found no officer guilty and was not even allowed to be tried for the murder of Ms. Taylor in her home. The Black Lives Matter mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on the Black communities by the state and vigilantes. The call has been to tackle systemic racism in the US and across the globe. The juxtaposed force was recently reawakened by the election of Donald Trump in 2016. The Trump era has encouraged and emboldened racist and xenophobic rhetoric and behavior. It began immediately as he announced his candidacy, stating that Mexicans are bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists and murderers. He later stated that, why do we want all these people, people of color, from S-whole countries here. He was referring to African and Central American countries specifically. We should bring in more people from places like Norway. The third example is the Charlottesville white supremacist rally, when he stated that there are fine people on both sides. And even most recently on the nationally televised debates, he refused to unequivocally denounce white supremacists and told them to stand down and stand by. What creates an existential threat for Donald Trump and other white supremacists is the demographic shift that is occurring in America. This 2015 Pew Research Center graph shows the national race and ethnicity trends. The percentage of the white population is decreasing while the non-white population is increasing significantly, in particularly Latinos. For instance, whites made up 85% of the US population in 1960, 64% in 2010, and they are predicted to make up only 43% of the US population in 2060. It is predicted that the US will be a majority non-white population around 2040. Folks, that is 20 years away from now. California became the first non-majority white state in 2000, and in 2014 became the first state with a Latino plurality. The UN census table here shows that states with the largest population increases from 2000 to 2010, all 10 states with the largest population increases have a fast-growing Latinx population. California, who already has the largest population of any state with over 37 million residents, had a population increase of 10% on par with the national average. Hopefully we could get a census completed soon so we could get some more updated data on this. The California Department of Education shows that demographic trends are even more pronounced if we examine K-12 public schools in California. The data show that almost 80% of the students are non-white and over half of the total population is Latinx and less than a quarter are white. Yes, there are twice as many Latinx students than white students in California public schools. There are over 60% students in poverty if measured by free and reduced lunch, and 20% are learning English as a second language. There are over 70 languages spoken in California schools, yet over 80% of these students are Spanish speaking. Here are the demographics for LAUSD, the second largest school district in the country with over 600,000 students. Only 10% of the students are white. 90% are non-white, with 70% Latinx students, 20% ELs, and of those, 92 of them are Spanish speaking. I share these data with you because it foretells our future. We will be a majority non-white country within our lifetime. We have a racial reckoning moment that requires us to confront the racial legacies of our past to transform and reimagine our future. So how does this relate to school finance? The school finance literature routinely engages in the economic concepts of efficiency, productivity, liberty, equality, equity, and adequacy. The more progressive school finance scholars ask questions such as, how do we achieve a more equitable and adequate school finance system? I've come to the moment where I would argue that equity and adequacy are necessary, but insufficient to fundamentally transform our school finance system. We need to critically interrogate and acknowledge that our school finance system is grounded in coloniality, white supremacy, xenophobia, and linguistic hegemony that have historically marginalized Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and immigrant people and communities. I argue that not until we move towards an anti-racist, anti-xenophobic school finance system will we be able to achieve the promise of a truly equal educational opportunity for all. So to start, let's get some common definitions. Racism, according to the Anti-Defamation League, is the marginalization and or oppression of people of color based on socially constructed racial hierarchy that privileges white people. Kendi rejects the idea that racism is born out of ignorance. Racism, history shows, is born out of profitability and utility. Two fundamental social historical ideological tenets of racism are colonialism and white supremacy. Colonialism is the policy of a country seeking to extend or retain its authority over people or territories, generally with the aim of economic dominance. In the process of colonialism, colonizers imposed their religion, language, economics, and other cultural practices. White supremacy is the belief that white people are superior to those other races and thus should dominate them. Xenophobia is the fear or hatred of which is perceived to be foreign or strange. It is suspicious of the other and the other's activities, a desire to eliminate their presence and fear of losing national, ethnic, and racial identity. According to Gramsci, the concept of hegemony provides a philosophical framework within which we can explore the power relations between the dominant and minority groups, particularly the means by which a dominant group secures its power and position. Wiley in 2000 states that language hegemony is achieved when a dominant group creates a consensus by convincing the others to accept that their language norms and usage and standards and is ensured that they convince them to meet those who fail to meet the standards to view their own failure as a result of inadequacies in their own language. Joe Fegan states systemic racism includes the complex array of practices, the unjustly gained political economic powers of whites, the continuing economic and other resource inequalities among racial lines, and the white racist ideologies and attitudes created to maintain and racialize white privilege and power. Systemic here means the core racist realities are manifested in each of society's major parts: the economy, politics, education, religion, even family. Reflects the fundamental realities of systemic racism. Anti-racism, Kimberly Crenshaw asserts, is the active dismantling of system privileges and everyday practices that reinforce and normalize the contemporary dimensions of white dominance. This, of course, also involves a critical understanding of the history of whiteness in America. The United States pretends to operate in a colorblind, non-racialized school finance system. A nation's school finance system cannot be separated from the social, political, and historical context. As Crenshaw asserts, we need to have a critical understanding of the history of whiteness in America to dismantle systemic racism and move towards an anti-racist paradigm. The creators of the school finance systems over the years have never explicitly acknowledged race as a salient construct in designing a school funding mechanism. The proxy for race has been poverty. The proxy for Latinos has been language. This is problematic. Not all people of color are poor. Not all poor people of color, not all poor people are people of color. Not all Latinos are learning English as a second language. Conflating poverty and race and language ignores the unique experiences of being a person of color, of being a person of immigrant status, or learning a second language. That is unique. I will briefly provide an overview of each of these historical eras and its intersections with school finance. Albeit it did not start with British colonialism. The British were involved in genocide and forceful and deceitful displacement of indigenous and people from their land. The British brought the first Black slaves to the New England colonies in 1619. Less than 20 years later, public schooling began in Massachusetts in 1635 with the Boston Land School. The Massachusetts Act of 1647 established the right of the state to require communities to create and maintain elementary schools. The affluent families sent their children to private schools, and public schools were not even widely attended at that time. Of course, public schools were not designed for Blacks or Indigenous people. The Massachusetts Act of 1647 established the tradition that public schools should be funded through local property tax, as land was considered to be a valid measure of wealth. Establishing property taxes as a basis for funding public schools quickly caught on in other New England colonies, and it remains a tradition today, albeit not the only source. Robert Slavin states, the US is the only nation to fund elementary and secondary schools based on local wealth. So the United States is actually very unique in the way that it funds public education. What was the impact of using property taxes? It creates an inherent inequity by the amount of revenue a locality is able to generate and the tax effort to achieve it. In addition, this creates an asymmetrical power dynamic between those that own property and those that did not. Those that own property naturally felt that schools belonged to them and should cater to their children. Very few Blacks were able to buy their own freedom and purchase land, and Native people did not ascribe to the concept of land owning. We will revisit this concept of land and property taxes again during this talk. The Declaration of Independence occurred in 1776, but the US Constitution was not created until 1787, and it did not explicitly mention education nor guarantee education of any type. This same year marked the first time that the federal government got involved with public education through the Northwest Ordinance, which authorized establishment of public higher education institutions, obviously using Native American land. Most germane to K-12 education is that it required that each state have an education provision in its basic laws, but did not provide any criteria to this provision. So this created states with the obligation to create an educational system. So we have 50 different systems within the United States. Then in 1791, the 10th Amendment was passed. It states the power not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to it by the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. According to the Constitute Project, 195 out of 203 countries in the world include education in their constitutions, including all the countries outperforming the United States on international education metrics. The United States is one of the very few countries that does not see education as a fundamental right for every citizen. This era saw the United States geographic expansion fueled by genocide and displacement of Native Americans, economic exploitation of slaves, and hostile treaties. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1810, and then lost close to half of its territory after the Mexican-American War and the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe. Mexicans in the US suffered land and wealth loss that they have never recovered from. There was only one person that was left after several years after 1848 from Mexican descent that had true wealth, what we would consider the top 1%. By 1865, 36 states were admitted to the Union. The Civil War began in 1861 and then ended in 1865 with one of the primary topics around slavery. The abolitionists ultimately declared victory in 1865 as slavery was outlawed. At the end of the Civil War started the Reconstruction Era in the United States. How would it integrate free Blacks into the fabric of society? How would the United States move toward a vision of emancipation or continue a vision grounded in white supremacy? Ironically, interestingly, and probably not surprisingly, the KKK was officially formed in 1865 in Tennessee as a reaction to this. At the beginning, the emancipation vision made some positive strides towards equality, in particular for Blacks with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery, creating citizenship rights, due process, equal protections, and voting rights. Blacks were allowed to own land, run for office, and vote, at least Black men. The Freedmen's Bureau was created to support the transition from slaves to freed Blacks, and for the first time, the federal government intervened and funded schools on behalf of Blacks, and actually poor whites in the bordering southern states. James Anderson, in his ARA Brown lecture of 2014, articulates the political and educational progress of Black Americans in Alabama's Black Belt counties during this time in terms of positive school enrollment, the length of the school calendar, teacher pay and funding, voting participation, and holding political office. Blacks were, again, able to own land and property much easier than ever before. However, the Compromise of 1877 withdrew the US troops from the former Confederate States and allowed the former Confederate States to deal with the Blacks without Northern interference. This had catastrophic consequences for Blacks, not only in Southern states, but across the country. In pre-1900, school funding was only a local responsibility, funded by local taxation. Again, property taxes. Again, this favored those affluent white communities that had higher property wealth to generate more revenue from property taxes, even if they taxed themselves at a lower or equal rate. The origins of the modern school finance era starts with Elwood Cubberley, who in 1905 theorized that states should bear some of the responsibility and acknowledging the inequities of local taxation as the only means to fund public education. But he did not link this or think about this in racial terms. His equity concern was more of a rural versus an urban concern. He created what is commonly known as flat grants. They provide an equal amount of funding based on certain variables, in particular teacher ratios, programmatic innovations, and quality. Cubberley believed in rewarding effort for localities as well. However, this favored affluent white districts since they had more revenue to make the effort in hiring more teachers or providing more innovative and higher quality programming. George Strayer and Robert Haig are known as the grandfathers of the foundation program concept. They theorized that the state should generate revenue to provide a minimal level of support. However, property wealth districts that were racially segregated were still able to generate more revenue from property taxes, again, even if they taxed themselves at a lower rate. Paul Mort evolved the foundation program theory and suggested that there should be strong support from state and local levels to generate revenue, not at a minimal level, but a basic level, to provide a basic education known as power equalization. However, this model also does not appropriately address the inequities found in property wealth and segregated districts. Some sort of foundation program is the most commonly used system. I believe over 35 states use a foundation program, even today. I do want to acknowledge someone named Henry Morrison, who in 1930 proposed a full state funding model to eliminate the influence of property tax inequities. He proposed to use state income taxes creating a one state district, eliminated individual districts across the state. This idea was not well received at the time because it threatened the concept of local control. However, none of these funding systems dealt with race or language and the inherent inequities and needs. The primary way a state generates revenue beyond local taxation is through state income taxes, sales taxes, and other forms of state taxation. The individual state income tax was created in the early 1900s, with Wisconsin being one of the first adopters. Most states have adopted a state income tax, but some do not, such as where I'm currently at in Texas and Florida. The federal income tax system was created in 1913 through the 16th Amendment that states, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever sources derived without appropriation among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. Federal contributions were less than 1% in this era. In the 1930s and 40s, many states introduced state sales taxes to generate additional revenue to finance public schools. Many state laws were regressive and provided state breaks for wealthy white individuals that we still see today. The Jim Crow era introduced many state and local racial segregation laws that reaffirmed economic, social, political, and educational racial discrimination. These laws were institutionalized in the Plessy v. Ferguson U.S. Supreme Court case of 1896 that stated separate but equal was lawful. This ruling allowed not only Southern states, but states across the country to enact Jim Crow type laws, such as voter suppression, prohibiting interracial marriage, segregating public accommodations. In terms of education, states prohibiting racially mixed schools, some withheld funding for non-segregated schools, and other states stated that taxes paid by Blacks go to maintaining African schools. All of this in statute. And the duty of the legislature is to encourage colored schools. Even in 1958, after Brown decision in Texas, a statute was passed stating that no child would be compelled to attend schools that are racially mixed. No desegregation unless approved by election, and the governor would be able to use troops if the federal authorities came in. I would like to focus on housing discrimination laws because this is interrelated with the school finance system. From 1900 to 1917, exclusionary housing zoning ordinances across the country legally forbade minorities from occupying blocks where the majority of the residents were white, including in Los Angeles and in California. In 1917, the Buchanan case, US Supreme Court case, ruled that outright city segregation ordinances violated the 14th Amendment. In the aftermath of this ruling, segregationists turned to restrictive neighborhood convenience. So from 1917 to 1948 and until 1968, racial convenience and redlining took into effect. When a restrictive convenience existed on a property deed or plat map, the owner was legally prohibited from selling to a member of a specific minority group or groups listed in the convenience. These contracts thus hampered the individual freedom of the signer and all future property owners to sell to whomever they chose. If an owner violated the restriction, they could be sued and held financially liable. Because of this legal obligation, racial restrictions were rarely contested, which is a key reason why they were so effective. In addition, the use of racial restrictive convenience removed the need to zoning ordinances. In that way, they served to segregate cities without any blame being placed on municipal leaders. A decade later, in 1926, the US Supreme Court affirmed the legality of the racial convenience in the Covergan case. The term redlining, which is sometimes heard recently, was coined by sociologist John McKnight in the 1960s and derives from how the federal government and lenders would literally draw a red line on a map around a neighborhood that they would not invest in based on demographics. Blacks and Latino inner city neighborhoods were the most likely to be redlined. Investigations found that lenders would make loans to lower income whites, but not to middle or upper income African Americans or Latinos. The result of this redlining in real estate could still be felt decades today. Homes in redline districts are worth less than half or even more than homes of that the government has deemed to be best. I'm always asked, professor, or professor really, why do all the Mexicans live together? And I said, it's not because we like each other all that much. It's because of these housing zoning laws that actually restricted where we were able to live for a long period of time. Most modern school district boundaries were institutionalized in the 1940s and 50s. These were racially motivated boundaries, but just before the Mendez and Brown decisions, desegregation decisions. Even today, the school district tends to mirror the racial makeup of the neighborhood, and these derived from the redlining policies previously discussed. Because home values in these redline districts in Black and Brown communities are valued significantly less, and they generate lower property tax revenue. The Civil Rights era arguably started with the landmark US Supreme Court decision Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, although desegregation in California was actually because of the Mendez case with Mexican American communities in 1946, which stated racially segregated schools were unconstitutional, ending the separate but equal doctrine. Many civil rights legislation was passed, such as the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. In addition, the federal government became more involved in public education with the National Defense Act of 1958. But more consequentially, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. This created federal funding for different initiatives, such as students in poverty, funding bilingual students through Title I and Title VII. However, although well-meaning, these initiatives viewed students of color and English learners as culturally or environmentally deficient. Thus, funds provided to remediate, compensate, or to assimilate. These remedies are typically of inferior quality and rigor, which helps institutionalize low achievement and helps create the achievement gaps. The post-civil rights era can be most concretely defined as the school finance litigation era. Now that the separate but equal doctrine was overturned and civil rights legislation passed, communities of color, after 32 generations of oppression, were able to fight for their rights in a legal manner. The school finance litigation is typically defined in three waves. The first wave litigation argued federal equal protection under the 14th Amendment, such as the San Antonio v. Rodriguez case and the Serrano v. Priest case, which was actually a California case. The US Supreme Court ruled that school funding is a state responsibility in the San Antonio v. Rodriguez case. However, the Serrano v. Priest school finance lawsuit questioned both the constitutionality at the federal and state level of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. The Serrano case was the first successful lawsuit against the state, and it was California. The second wave was focused on state equity litigation, challenging the state's education clause, and the third wave of litigation was focused on state adequacy cases, also based on the state's education clause. It sort of argues, are states providing adequate funding to meet state benchmarks or outcomes? There have been over 40 states that have faced these school finance lawsuits since 1969. School finance lawsuits created some positive changes, yet fell short of creating transformative change. Some states updated their school finance systems to address inter-district inequality, yet those disparities across districts, albeit less, still exist. Some states developed supplemental weights or funding for special populations, although these vary across states and some don't have them still. Some states increase funding to address adequacy issues, yet we still have inadequate funding. 3 states where school finance litigation could be argued made a real difference were or are New Jersey after the Abbott case, Kentucky after the Rose case, and Wyoming after the Campbell case. I think it is worth mentioning that school desegregation progress made in the late 1960s and early 70s has been largely reversed after the Milliken decision in 1974. The data shows that we are as racially segregated today than we were in 1960. And Latinos in California are some of the most segregated in the country. So Baker and colleagues published an annual school funding fairness report card. They look at 4 metrics: funding levels, funding distribution, effort, and coverage. California, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Florida do poorly on all 4 measures. New Jersey and Wyoming do relatively well on all 4 measures. So California, I don't think should be very proud of not being able to say that they distribute, that they fund at a certain level, provide the effort, or cover the students as well as other states. They get a D or an F on all of these 4 metrics. And also, this analysis does not take race or language into account in determining fairness, only poverty. Funding for English learners did not begin in earnest until the post-civil rights era, with the Federal Bilingual Education Act and then state-level Bilingual Education Acts. Then integrating funding systems in funding for these students into the state funding systems. States primarily use 4 methods to fund English learners: a foundation formula, resource allocation model, and then ELL weights. California recently changed their funding system to a local control funding formula where it targets 20% additional base funds for English learners. But across the states, the definitions for English learners vary. The who gets them, what, for how long, and what criteria is used varies across these states, as well as 3 states do not provide any funding for English learners: Alabama, Mississippi, and Montana. Here you see some of the research conducted on ELLs and school funding. It shows that ELs are inequitably funded, they're inadequately funded. Higher performing schools expend more money than lower performing schools, especially when you take into account English learners. Personnel, the teachers, the leaders matter. The facilities matter, like your school size, your density, and the culture that creates matters, and the overall resources to fund curriculum matters. There's also a lot of misuse of ELL funds and inappropriate use of ELL funds. And the higher the federal investment is across states, the lower the local state contribution seems to be. So it seems like states, when they receive more federal funding for English learners or students in poverty, they tend to then say, we're going to invest less than. So instead of supplementing the funding, it's almost like the federal funds are used, whether overtly or not, to supplant the funding of the state and the local governments. And then also that there's these high leverage practices that seem to be effective. Class size, enriched curriculum, like these dual language programs, but not only in affluent communities, but in communities where they're most needed. High quality teachers, parent engagement, ongoing professional development, and ongoing assessment. Using RISA's language policy orientation framework, the school finance system has seen language as a problem to remediate and assimilate. Until recently, language is now being seen as a right in some aspects, but we need to move to language as a resource, not only as a right, but as a way to actually provide that equal educational opportunity. In justice theory, there are four primary types of justice that are discussed: distributive justice, procedural justice, retributive justice, restorative justice. Distributive justice is the most commonly type of justice that's applied to school finance. And this deals with equitably distributing wealth. So how can we equitably distribute wealth? And even then, it's easy to argue that that has not been well accomplished. Procedural justice is who and in what ways are decisions being made, and how are they being made, and for whom and for what. Many times, those in charge of the decision-making process do not understand the realities of those that they're making the decisions for. So how can procedurally we can create a more democratic, just system of funding schools? Retributive justice deals with sort of the punishment, sort of an eye for an eye type of justice. And restorative justice really is about how should we actually deal with sort of the transgressions and how do we actually create dialogue and healing in communities. So I'm beginning to theorize that really to transform the school finance system, we really need to think about the distributive justice, the procedural justice, and the restorative justice, and think about how those in combination can transform our school finance system. So I'll take the risk of laying out some pillars for an anti-racist, anti-xenophobic school finance system. 1, race and ethnicity and immigration and language need to be central. It needs to be focused on dismantling privileges and practices that reinforce and normalize white supremacy, xenophobia, and linguistic hegemony. It needs to be focused on equality of education opportunity, equity, quality, and the dignity, not only individual dignity, but of community dignity. It's multidimensional, right? As you can see from our history, we need to not only talk about educational policy, but housing policy, economic policy, urban planning policy, language policy, immigration policy, etc. And thus, by definition, is interdisciplinary: economics, education, sociology, political science, law, history, etc. And again, it needs to go beyond the distributive notions of justice. It needs to really include procedural, how and who makes those laws, and then restorative. When you deal with having to create just systems, it also means that you need to deal with the demographic shifts, not only nationally, but in local communities. And how do you then deal with communities that are mixed or that have been segregated, and what implications and what dialogue do those communities need to have internally? So if I ruled the world, right, what would be some recommendations at the federal level? Make education a constitutional right. Reauthorize the Education Every Student Succeeds Act to be more asset-based. Increase overall federal funding, but without decreasing state and local level contributions. And for targeting efforts in desegregation and for specific communities that have been marginalized. At the state level, develop opportunity and outcome-based standards and benchmarks, create state oversight funding model, create a diversified and reliable revenue streams, eliminate hold harmless. Hold harmless are these pacts that people make in politics where they say nothing's going to change for you or for your district or for your community. And it's sort of like the tax loopholes that we have in our tax system, right? Increase overall funding at the state level, again, targeting those specific groups and initiatives, and provide guidelines to local education agencies with civil rights and evidence and innovative-based practices. California just created a new funding system in 2013. And you cannot assume just because you change a system, one, that it's a fair system, that it's sufficiently funded, and that the changes that you're proposing at the local level are going to be implemented without training and capacity building and professional development. Because what leaders tend to do is when they receive more money, for example, they tend to spend it on things they typically spend it on, or their personal preferences. So that's not really going to sort of change the dynamics of how that money is spent at the local level. And then local policy is intra-district and school level racial equity, quality, transparency, and accountability. I call districts the black box, because you sort of know what's happening at the district level, but then you don't know how they're redistributing and reallocating those funds at the school level and even at the classroom level, and provide ongoing professional development and desegregation efforts. So thank you for your time, and maybe we have a few minutes for some questions.
Yes, we do. Can you do the stop sharing? Gracias, Dr. Jimenez. Applause, everybody. Do the virtual applause. I think you can see the little hands. Everybody, this is a great presentation. We didn't pay him, so applause, louder, because, Cal Poly's poor. We're not like Trinity College or USC with the big bucks. So I just want to say a few things, and then there's some comments, and I want others to comment and to ask questions. One, I think this is a fantastic presentation. It's very interdisciplinary, where not only did you talk about education, but you also sociology, history, law, and I see a little bit of critical race theory there. So I think it was fascinating how you're able to integrate a lot of these different disciplines to tell a story that is very coherent, and especially someone like yourself, who comes from the background of the same school districts that are devastated or underfunded, like I did when I grew up in East Los Angeles and attending public schools. So that being said, I encourage the students, because all of them are brilliant. I tell the students that they're all smarter than me when I was their age, many, many years ago. But one question, Dr. Jimenez, has to do with, why is it that Latinos, even though we're a big population in big demographic in certain areas, why is it that we still experience segregation? What can we do to overcome that?
I'm not a desegregationist expert, so I have to just preface that. However, it was unavoidable for me to create this scholarly talk, and ultimately this is going to be a book project, without getting into the issue of segregation. And it's no small thing, right? I mean, and so, we have to, I think about what were the efforts made to desegregate schools in the, late 60s, early 70s, and even up to, 70s, late 70s in some instances. And then slowly but surely, they sort of stopped. So I think one of the things that, creates an issue is, before it used to be a de jure segregation, right? It was sort of by law, right? These convenants that were racialized. Now it's something called a de facto segregation. At least some people like to name it that way, where now it's sort of by choice. But the question becomes, really, what are the real choice options in terms of where to live? And so I think this is where sort of the economics and the urban planning, Álvaro, I mean, you're an expert in that area. If we don't create mixed housing, there's no way to even get close to sort of desegregation, especially in new areas. The harder topic potentially is in like urban core LA, for example, right? Like that have long histories, and there's a lot of pride and a lot of culture in these communities. So, you know, is the busing, right? Originally, do you bus kids? And I know, you know, from my readings and understanding of desegregation, you know, many times you would have, you know, Latinx kids used to have to, you know, wake up, you know, an hour and a half, 2 hours early to get to school, to get bused to another school for these desegregations. So even in the communities that it was intended to support, then you're still creating sort of these obstacles. So the question becomes, and this is where restorative justice comes in, and I haven't thought it all the way through, because, you know, this is where you need to have really deep, meaningful conversations with the community and the communities, because some are very long-standing historical communities, you know, but then some are being gentrified. So how does that play a role, right? Some are becoming, some historically Black communities in the LA area are becoming much more brown, and so I think you need to really think about sort of what the community needs are and desires. And I'm not going to be smart enough to say what they may be. The question becomes, so there's new land, there's traditional land, and there's changing lands. All of them require a different type of remedy, if you will. And even in those that you cannot fully desegregate, then you need to think about how can you provide an equal education opportunity for those school districts. Now, you know, the question becomes, you know, is the answer breaking up LAUSD, for example, into these smaller pods of school districts? What tends to happen nationally is when a larger district becomes smaller districts, they actually become more segregated. So typically that is not the real solution as well. So it's a real complex problem that needs to be looked at, you know, in multiple ways, from new communities, transitioning communities, to sort of historical communities that have a long legacy. And it needs to be a dialogue with the community, not a policy recommendation coming from the state of California.
But thank you for that response. Very thoughtful. I was a product actually of a desegregation, and it was terrible. There was nothing good about it. It was from East LA to Sunland, Tahunga in the suburbs, and the white kids threw rocks at us at the bus. It was like Birmingham, Alabama. And we're not talking 1960 here. We're talking early 80s. So it was just an awful experience. And unfortunately, people that don't live in our communities are deciding these decisions for us. And for the first time in my life, I realized, you know, what racism was, unfortunately. Someone asked another question. Well, you have a lot of excellent questions, I must say. Actually, I text my students, ask this question. Someone posed a question about how do we improve the EL system?
Yeah, right
and,
now.
And mention what EL, can you elaborate what EL means? Because
English
most
learners is a label, right? We're talking about labels here. So
okay.
I'm not condoning the label. It's just a label used.
Sure.
And you know, the research is also now labeling them emergent bilinguals. You know, you can think about them as multilinguals, but basically students that are learning English as a second language, if you will, right? So that's sort of the ELs in very broad generic terms. And you know, most sort of policy folks say, well, you know, race, what does a Mexican American, or what does a Mexican, or what does a Black student need in additional resources than a white student or a regular student? And many times policymakers, for a variety of reasons, say, okay, let's take race off the table, right? But English learners, or language, is typically a way to sort of say, okay, language, those students that don't speak English, right? Because English is the dominant language, they do need some support. So we can actually get on board and say, we should fund students that are learning English as a second language and provide them extra support. So right now, in California, I'll use California as an example, they provide 20% above a base rate. So if we give each student $1,000 every rate, you know, base student, every student $1,000, an English learner would then receive $1,200, right? So it's a 20% bump on top of that. The problem with the system right now is that there's no coherence. So why 20%? It's a political compromise, right? It's sort of saying, well, you know, we do feel like there's a need. It should be above maybe just the teens. And how much is our revenue? So how much can we allocate to English learners? How many are there? So it really doesn't become a pedagogical or programmatic or instructional decision. It's a political budgetary compromise. So that's the first issue. If you want to solve the issue, is that we need to make it more cohesive, where the funding reflects the type of instruction and the type of pedagogy, the type of program that English learners need. Secondly, they're categorized as an English learner. So not all English learners are made the same, right? It's a very sort of diverse set of students. So you need to think about, is an English learner that starts in kindergarten different than a recent immigrant that starts in 11th grade? They're funded the same in our current system. I would argue that they have different needs that would have probably different investment levels required. You know, English learners develop in language. So is a student that is, you know, barely starting to acquire English the same as someone that is almost fluent, or, you know, the literature says redesignated to English fluent proficient? So right now we have an incohesive, and the way that we fund them, California funds them at 20%. There's another state that funds them at over 100%. And there's some states that don't fund them at all. So, you know, there's, and the way that we organize, or the criteria, some states fund an English learner for 1 year, that's it. Some states fund them for 3 years. Some states fund them if they're in a bilingual program. So if you're an English learner and not in a bilingual program, you don't get additional funds. And then we don't have any way of accountability and responsibility for the districts to actually funnel those funds to the individual student. So the district receives the funds per student, but it doesn't necessarily follow the individual student, if that makes sense. They make the decisions of how to then allocate them. So if they have one school that they really want to target and they want to have an influx of funds to serve those students, they could choose to do that and ignore maybe other schools that have smaller populations. So density matters. It's different to fund students that when it's 90% English learner or 50% English learner versus you have 10 of them, 10 English learners. So we need to have a more cohesive, nuanced system that accounts for the type of student and the type of programming that they're in.
Gracias for that, Profe. I want to bring it a little bit more home. I think a lot of our students are really learning a lot. I'm glad because they haven't been learning in my class because I just talk about myself. So I'm happy about that. But also what I like about your, not necessarily your presentation, but yourself as an individual is that I believe that you represent a lot of our student population here at Cal Poly Pomona. First generation, son of immigrants from Zacatecas. We have a lot of people from Zacatecas.
Jalisco, por favor.
Jalisco. Oh, sorry. That's what happens when you drink too early in the day. But also coming like working class. So can you talk a little bit about, because I'm sure there's students here that want to be teachers, that want to be professors. I'm sure they're smarter than both of us combined, especially the Latinas in the room. But can you talk a little bit about more when you were growing up in your household, in, let's say, high school, and what were you thinking about? Like, how did you get to the university in the first place, and what type of guidance that you receive or didn't receive, that an advice that you wish you would have gotten early in life, that these young students of ours and people that just want to get ahead, not necessarily seeing what you are today, but how is it that you were able to get to where you're at today?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a long story, so I'll try to keep it concise. And I just want to make a mention, because this will probably be the last question if you guys finish at the quarter past the hour. If you have other questions, and I see a lot of them, feel free to email me, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation. So, but
we can go like 5 minutes over or so.
Okay.
So feel free, yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is a great question, and
The bell doesn't ring until 10 minutes late.
Very good. So what I also like I said, my parents came to the United States. They were small business owners, right? And in Mexico, small business owners you're pretty poor too, and so they already had 7 children at the time, and I was the youngest. And so they made the decision to come to the United States to look for a better life. They sacrificed themselves and their ambitions and their dreams to a large degree. They became farm workers in California, and then but before we moved to Dixon, we actually lived in East LA. So those of you who live in East LA, in La Puente, we did a pit stop in East LA. We had family there, and then we went up north and first to Ventura, the oranges up there, and then the citrus, and then up north to Dixon. But my parents always told us, lo que yo quiero es que tú no trabajes igual de duro que yo. So their ambition was that we didn't have to work as hard as them. That was their ambition and their sole purpose. So my mother was not allowed to be educated past 2nd grade because, at that time, women in Mexico, or young girls in Mexico, as long as you're able to read a little bit, ya estuvo. My father was allowed to finish junior high, and then after junior high, he was made to work. And so none of them graduated even from high school, but they understood the value of education. And many times people believe that our Mexican American or Mexican community or Latinx community does not value education. I would say to the contrary, 150%. They actually show it by their actions, how much they value, how the risk that they're able and willing to take to that. So, you know, in high school, I got into, my older siblings went to the university. So, you know, if you're the oldest person in your family, my sister, I always give her the credit because she could have went to work, she could have got married, she could have done a lot of other things except pursue an education. So I always tell her and thank her and said, you changed the trajectory of our family because she set the model and then all of us followed incredibly, right? It should be the norm, not the exception. And the way that I was able to do it was a lot of support from programs in schools that would expose me to nature, to expose me to the urban setting, because this, you know, it was a small town between Sacramento and San Francisco. So it would expose me to different environments. Teachers played a big role. I remember a teacher advocating on my behalf against discriminatory practice against me by another teacher. And she literally stood up for me in front of me and challenged the other teacher. That had a huge impact. So if you're a teacher, you know, your actions really do matter and kids really do pay attention. In the university, to be quite honest, and this may be where you're absolutely right, Álvaro, where, you know, I almost dropped out of university my first year. I didn't study. I didn't do the things that a college student should do. And luckily, one of my sisters, older sisters, found out that I was about to get expelled from the university because I wasn't passing the courses. I wasn't attending the courses. Because I wasn't attending the courses, I wasn't passing. And she said, Oscar, you need to take care of this. So I took care of that, and I had to beg counselors, and I had to tell them, you know what, I'm really smart. I just haven't tried. And some counselors didn't believe me, but there was a counselor that did. And that counselor sort of, without me telling a long story, said, yeah, I'll sign your paperwork for you to get another chance. Because I told them I still want to graduate in 4 years. And I told them how I needed to take summer courses and additional units. And I graduated in 4 years at the end of the day. And some of those professors are still my mentors today. So, you know, folks like yourself, Álvaro, who work and mentor those students, it's amazing the impact that people can do. And then in the professorship, I didn't know what a PhD was. I didn't know what a doctorate was. I literally didn't. And then one of my graduate professors, Ruben Espinosa, who I didn't know, but was like the first Chicano school finance expert, like, give me a break. How lucky can I be, right? And he took me under his wing, him and Alberto Ochoa. And some of you from LA and San Diego may know Alberto. He was one of the founders of PIQUE, which is the Parent Institute for Quality Education, and Ruben Espinosa, like I said. And they sort of said, you need to go to get your PhD. And then in my PhD, you know, they became my mentor still. I graduated on time, and you know, when I first went out on the market, I like to say I applied to 16 jobs. I got 8 interviews and 4 offers. And that just goes to show you how this kid, you know, de la nada, right? had these great opportunities. And now I've worked at some of the most prestigious universities in the world. And, you know, and like Álvaro always says, you know, if we can do it, you can too.
That's very great, very inspiring. If the students weren't around, I'll be tearing up and everything. I don't want to lose my street cred, you know, from the projects. I think this story, and we'll wrap it up in 2 minutes because I know students have to leave. I think this is the most important part of the presentation in terms of how is it that somebody, given the trajectory of your parents and growing up in the community you did, you know, gets to the position where he's at or she's at, but and then doesn't turn around and sell out his or her community, right? And kind of like commits. And I know this about you. Over the years, we've known each other. You've committed your life. You're successful. I'm sure your wife is also successful. Your siblings, but you've taken that success and that privilege for the benefit of the marginalized, of the racialized, you know, the otherized. So I really appreciate that. And I think when people, I know you got your BA from a CSU, right? Which campus did you get it from?
Sacramento State University.
Yeah, Sacramento State. I was born in Sacramento, so that's the motherland for me. Every time I land there, I had to kiss the floor like the Pope, you know, because I was born there. But you know, you're a CSU product. A lot of our students that are here, there's others that are not, that are outside of the CSU system that are also listening to this and will listen to it. But these are the type of students that need to listen to these type of messages and these stories. Not the polished, refined professor that publishes in peer-reviewed articles and writes books and gives lectures, but someone who struggled at one point and through support overcame that. And actually, you know, obviously there's grit involved, you know, there's determination. But also what I love about it is the familia, you know, the importance of the familia, where this is where family comes in, you know, the siblings, and because the parents, unfortunately, you know, our parents, and I'm sure a lot of our students here today, is their parents are not in a position to read transcripts or to keep up in terms of how, you know, how they're doing, or how you were doing, or I was doing when I was in college, you know, back in the day. So I think these things are important to look at, not just the academic, but the personal, and to bring it together and to motivate others, to let them know that it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter where you come from. You know, what matters is where you're going. I think I copied that from a Vicente Fernandez song, but it's a matter about where we're going, and we're not going to make it individually. We have to make it as a community. And that goes for Black, Brown, Asian, white, working class, white communities. You know. So with that, I would like to thank my good friend Oscar, colega, and someone who's actually supported my own case and issues that I've dealt with in terms of microaggressions, and not thinking about himself always, but always thinking about others, and how can he be a mentor to not just his students, but his colleagues, to advance this idea of justice, you know, in education, a field that I know a lot of our students are interested in. You know, so for me, it's important that you know, we have people like yourselves as a role model. So I would like everybody to unmute or applaud. I know we have like this, it's kind of limited, but give a round of applause. Raise your hand to Oscar here, el profe.
I just want to say thank you to you and to the students in particular for putting up with me for an hour, for about an hour, and for allowing me to share a little bit about myself and the work that I'm passionate about. And if I can be supportive of any of them, you know, again, feel free to reach out to me, and you know, whatever I can do, I'm there. So thank you, Álvaro, for your friendship and your leadership as well.
Okay, muchas gracias. Goodbye, everybody. And I'll be providing the links shortly. People can email me tomorrow too.